I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. All right, welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. Happy 2026. I'm excited to kick this year off with two just amazing guests who've written a book. I will get out of the way and let you introduce yourselves.
Thanks very much for inviting us on your podcast. I'm Julian Barling. I'm currently in the School of Business at Queen's University in Kingston in Canada. I was originally from Zimbabwe, but I did not live there very long. I lived until I was in my early 30s in South Africa. And from South Africa came directly to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I've always been interested at the intersection of work and family. When I say always, I mean from the very early 1980s. And as a passion, my hobby has always been about reading about leadership. Sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, I started to do research on leadership. And this book with Simon, to some extent, is the culmination of an interest in leaders' mental health.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on to talk about the book, and happy 2026 to you and your listeners. And my name's Simon Rego, and I am coming to you today from the Bronx, New York, where I am in two primary roles. The first is at the Montefiore Medical Center, where I'm chief of psychology. And I also have an academic appointment at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where I am professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. You may hear it in my accent a little bit. I was born in Canada. I'm a Canadian and actually attended undergraduate training at Queen's University, and that's how I first crossed paths with Julian in the early 1990s. And fortunately, we reconnected and have found the way to write this book that's so meaningful to the two of us. And my lens, my background, my research interests all align with what the book is focusing on, which is evidence-based psychotherapies aimed at improving mental health, and more specifically cognitive behavioral therapy and its quote-unquote therapeutic cousins of dialectical behavior therapy and acceptance commitment therapy, and the roles that they can play to alleviate psychological burden and improve well-being.
Awesome. I'm so excited to have both of you here, two powerhouses with such, I think, really complementary and unique perspectives. Also, all the ties to Canada. My half Canadian heart swells with pride. But I do have you here to talk about your new book, the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Workbook for Leaders. And, Simon, you gave a little bit of a preview, but I would love to hear more about what can people expect from this workbook. It's a little bit outside of my comfort realm as an IO psychologist. I hear cognitive behavioral therapy and I say, no. That's for the clinical psychologists. But I think that there's a really compelling case that, this is important for the workplace and for occupational health, obviously. So, what can we expect from this kind of book?
Yeah, and I think if it might alleviate some of your hesitations if I try to say that at its core, it starts with I think is a very simple truth that leaders, in IO included, are human. And being human doesn't stop once you get a title or a promotion or the big fancy corner office. And in fact, Julian, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but his research on leadership will show that being in those positions can actually exacerbate and amplify the very human qualities that a lot of us are walking around with anyway: stress, anxiety, burnout, self-doubt. So we wanted to write a practical, evidence-based guide, if you will, for leaders who want to lead well while also embracing the challenges that inevitably emerge along the way by virtue of being human. And you said it right, that what was really fun about this project is Julian comes in with his decades of research on from the business and leadership side of things, and I'm coming in with my years of training as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, and we work together to translate and combine our lens of focus into a book that has concrete tools that go beyond specific self-care in a vague way and tackles the specific mental health challenges that Julian's research has shown actually undermine leadership. Things like anxiety and anger and depression, workaholism and sleep problems, etc. So it's meant to be very applicable to the human-like vulnerabilities that leaders have in their roles, and ultimately to make them better in their performance, which also spreads to the people on their teams.
Very cool. And so, Julian, it sounds like your role in some ways is identifying, like, we have these problems, that anxieties or other mental health issues are undermining leadership. And then Simon, your perspective is like, okay, here's what we can do about it. Is that sort of like the appropriate understanding of, rather we're not just pointing fingers at what potential problems are, but actually giving readers tools that they can use to address the problems that our research has identified?
Very definitely. That was our whole purpose and focus in writing this book. I don't think it helps anybody just by identifying the issues that do exist. And I think that's how we hope to make a difference. It's all about being able to pick up a book like this, finding yourself in the book. You won't find yourself in every chapter, but you may open the book. There's a chapter on burnout. And we start the chapter on burnout by talking about some of the research on burnout and leadership, and then transition into evidence-based methods that you can use to try and help burnout and specifically emotional exhaustion. And very specifically, these are evidence-based tools that you can use in private, which is important because you don't have to go and see somebody. You don't have to take off work. It's cost effective, and the evidence supports the use of all the techniques we speak about in the book.
Simon, you mentioned not just cognitive behavioral therapy, but also sister types of approaches. Again, as an occupational health psychologist, this is not my wheelhouse, and I imagine it's also not the wheelhouse of many of our listeners. And so can you just very briefly give us an overview of what the different approaches look like?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say in application, it doesn't really matter if people are get a little anxious about it. It's on the theoretical side that we researchers get really particular about which approaches have particular strengths and which ones target particular what we call psychopathological mechanisms that perpetuate people's problems. But in essence, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy are all cut from the same cloth, or you think of them as branches on the same tree. And they all basically start with the premise that what perpetuates a lot of people's struggles are their thoughts and their emotions and their behavioral patterns. And then there's nuanced differences in how they approach helping people learn skills that help them address those three domains: thoughts, feelings, and actions. But ultimately, what they're all trying to do is teach people a set of practical, quickly applied tools or techniques that help people step back, re-examine some of their thoughts that might be contributing to their emotional states and or their behavioral patterns that may be perpetuating the areas that they struggle with, and learn how to turn those around to achieve a more balanced way of living.
If I can just jump in there with a thought. As Simon and I have been talking over all these years, what I've learned from Simon is that the kind of thoughts you might be talking about are thoughts that are not infrequent for leaders. It would be thoughts such as, I failed, I'm always a failure, I can never do this. And people can be very harsh on themselves. And then one day it just struck me, if somebody's leader said that to you, you're a failure, you can never do this, and so forth, we would call that abusive leadership. So how can we help people try and change those thought patterns? And that's where cognitive behavioral therapy and so forth really come to the fore. They are really helpful in getting people to challenge their thoughts, to challenge the evidence for those thoughts. And when they do that, behavioral change just becomes more possible.
Yeah, and I'll jump in with Julian for one more point, because I think I'm stealing this from something I learned from Julian along the way in the work we did. And I may be misquoting you slightly, Julian, but the message I took from our work is mental health isn't just a personal thing, it's a professional thing. And a leader's emotional state will shape the decision-making, the communication, the culture, the psychological safety of the workplace. And so if the leaders are depleted or reactive, it can spread. But if leaders learn some skills to be able to self-regulate, check and challenge problematic thoughts like Julian just described, and have clear values-driven behaviors, that can spread positively around the organization as well.
I think this is so smart. It's almost sneaky therapy where, we know that this can benefit people from like a humanistic perspective of like, this is good for you as a person, but that doesn't get nearly as many people as need to be into the doors of actually working on their mental health, but saying like, here's the business case. Like, this is why this is important for you as a leader to function and perform well, or even putting it, as you did, Julian, putting it into the language of management of, doesn't this look like abusive supervision, but towards yourself? I think opens up the doors to maybe an audience who wouldn't typically consider themselves as someone who needs therapy, or wouldn't traditionally be open to using some of these tools if they're labeled, mental health or therapy oriented. And I just think that's really interesting and really impactful, which I guess also brings me to my next question of, who do you envision benefiting the most from this? I mean, obviously, I think it sounds like everyone could benefit from it, but is there a particular audience or a particular reader that you guys were writing the book for that you thought this is the person that would benefit the most?
I'm happy to jump in, but I'd love to hear Julian's thoughts on this one, because remember, you're speaking to a cognitive behavioral psychologist. So I don't think there's anyone in 2026 living in the world that we're living in that couldn't use something to augment their ability to navigate life's challenges. The global stat is 1 in 4 people have some sort of mental health challenge. I think that's outdated. I think it's actually 1 in 1 have probably some mental health challenge these days that they're contending with in some aspect of their life. And again, I don't think leaders are immune at all. In fact, leaders are probably more vulnerable because they're having to manage themselves and their personal lives and everybody around them. So I see it as broadly applicable. And I also think if you're liberal in how you define what a leader is, who hasn't had or won't have some form of a leadership role in their life, be it on a small scale, on a team, in a band, a sports team, and broader into the business world. So I think it's broad, but Julian may have some very specific ideas about the world of business and organizational psychology.
In terms of who we wrote the book for, I can tell you, and in general, when I sit down to write, I try and apply a lesson I learned from Stephen King, the wonderful author who had a book quite a few years ago called On Writing. And one of the lessons he learned and does himself is, when he sits down to write a book, he sits down and thinks, who am I writing this for? And thinks of a person and writes it for them to make it as personal as possible. And when I sat down to do my writing, I didn't think of one person, but I thought of the kind of leaders that I've had the privilege of working with through executive courses or executive MBAs and so forth, executive coaches who do whatever they can to try and help leaders, in a sense, be well and lead well, for HR professionals who are tasked with these responsibilities. And I think that it just helps you to write better. If I can add a comment into that, a comment, Keaton, that you've made and Simon's made is about the responsibilities that leaders have for leading all these people. And there's no qualm about them leading all these people, but I think one of the challenges that they face right now, and that it's a challenge that goes far beyond just leading the people, is they actually have to lead the relationships between the people whom they lead. So if you had the luxury of leading 5 people, and there's actually a Gallup piece out today on the mean and median number of people that leaders lead, and it's a lot more than 5. 5 people actually means that you're leading about 20 some relationships. So those are the people who face these overwhelming odds, who I think we had in mind when we wrote the book. And Dr. Becky, the well-known child psychologist, she makes the point that what leads people to all these struggles that Simon are talking about, that land up with so many people, parents in her case, leaders in our case, facing these difficulties, is that we put people, leaders in this case, into situations where their emotions overwhelm their skills. And that's a direct quote from her. And I think what we're trying to do is provide people with more skills so that they can confront these situations and be better equipped to be the wonderful leaders that they try so hard to be.
I love that. There's so many things that come to mind as you were just describing, not only leading one-on-one, but navigating these relationships and how that part in particular can be overwhelming. From like a research perspective, I study teams and leadership, and certainly like the social network component of this, of how do the dynamics work together, is obviously something that is at the forefront of that research. And I think we still have a long ways to go to better understand the team processes. But emotionally, just like as a parent of two children, the hardest part about parenting is getting them to get along and like navigating their relationship. I can do one-on-one, I can navigate our relationships independently, but how do I like help them manage those relationships? And so think about that in the workplace too. I could see how having more tools to not be emotionally overwhelmed, to not let the emotions outweigh our skill set, would be particularly important. And as you pointed out, Simon, especially now, right? I think that the idea that the time is right for a book like this, because who isn't facing some sort of mental health challenge in 2026? I'm curious, how do you envision people using this book? Are we sitting on the beach reading it just like cover to cover? Is this something that I should bring my pencil to and be working on at night and treating like homework? Is this something that you expect me to go back to over the next 10 years when I'm in these challenging situations? Yeah, paint me a picture of what it looks like to use your book.
I'm happy to jump in, and then Julian, please join me in this. But as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, I'm so glad you asked that question, because this type of book where you're building skills requires you to practice building those skills. This is not a book that's just about reading or listening. If you get the Audible version, it's really about the doing. It takes some effort to develop a new skill, much like any other skill you would want to develop. You would not want to go for surgery to a surgeon who said, "Oh, I've read all the latest books on the surgical techniques I'm about to do, but I've not actually tried them before." That's not a surgery I want to sign myself up for. And so these things take practice. They're very simple. As Julian said, they can be done in private and then transported into the real world around us relatively easily. But they're going to take a bit of upfront commitment to practicing and feeling a little bit uncomfortable, because often to break out of patterns that we've developed over the years that we think are for our own good, when we're trying to expand our repertoire, it takes some discomfort to try some new things with the promise and prospect of managing things better. And the analogy I like to use with Julian and with my patients sometimes is that it's like you have an old pair of comfortable shoes that no longer offer any support, and they're broken down, but your feet just slide right into them. That's like conventionality. That's the current of the stream that'll keep you doing the same thing over and over again, even if it's costing you emotionally. And so when you buy a new pair of shoes, you have to be prepared, at least initially, for a little bit of a rub. And they might feel a little stiff until they're broken in a little bit. But if you stick with it and don't abandon them and get used to them, then you get all the benefits of the new shoes that you're wearing. These skills in the book that we describe are meant in the same way.
I love that analogy. And I think carrying it forward a little bit too, it sounds like maybe this book also not only represents a new pair of shoes, but maybe the shoe catalog of in 2-3 years when I'm stressed out in a totally different way that I've not experienced before, I can come back and reread it, re-explore, and find tools in a different light or in a different way that might not have been the most effective for me 2 years ago, but now in this new circumstance, they're exactly what I need.
And if I can just add to that, when you say come back 2 or 3 years later, this is not necessarily a book that to benefit from the book, you have to read every chapter up front. It's quite okay. Probably you want to read the first and last chapters, but then to go to the chapter that discusses the problems that you're currently facing and you want to change. And there's every chance that in a couple of years you may face a different challenge. And then the book is there for you to learn other tools that match that challenge. So I think that's very much part of the way you can use this book. But also organizational psychologists, and I think leaders too, love data. And one of the aspects of CBT that I've learned about is, to some extent, you become your own scientist, because many of the skills that you're going to learn, part of the acquisition of that skill learning is you're going to collect data on yourself before you start the technique. Before you start learning, you're going to collect data on yourself when you finish it. You're going to try and understand why you changed, why you, in a sense, may still have some obstacles, and redo some of the work. So there'll be a familiarity for sure for people who are in the organizational psychology realm.
Love that. We love science. We love science backed, but also the experience of like, I don't know, living life through that scientific lens of, I've changed something. Now what has changed as an outcome of this, and being really intentional about reflecting on those changes. I mean, you both have storied careers and have so much experience, but I have to imagine that as you write a book, new thoughts or perspectives come to light for you. And so, did anything surprise you, or did you learn anything while you were writing this book?
I would say for me, very definitely. I think that there's a understandable and a really beneficial focus on employee well-being. And I think that's been around both in research and in practice for about 10 years. And the focus on leaders' well-being just hasn't matched the focus on employee well-being. But I think that to some extent, we've started to try and change that. But what really surprised me was I would have loved to be able to start each chapter with outlining the prevalence of leaders' psychological challenges in these different areas. What do we know about leaders' anxiety and so forth? And the data just don't exist. So I think that one of the things we definitely need to do, both from a practical and a research perspective, is we need a much better understanding of the actual prevalence of these different issues if we're going to get companies to put the resources that are necessary into trying to solve them. So that's the one thing that surprised me. I think it's great that we're starting to research these areas, but we need a much clearer understanding. There is so much hype about how anxiety, burnout, depression, workaholism, etc., have supposedly increased since COVID, but there's no data to back up those assertions.
Simon, did anything surprise you?
I think the thing that surprised me the most, being relatively new to the literature on leadership, was how many resources there are on leadership skills. If you go on to any online bookseller and Google leadership skills, you're going to see page after page of books that seem to overlap in teaching particular skills around leadership. But there wasn't a book that did just this, despite the hundreds of books focusing on developing leadership skills. So that was kind of part of the rationale and part of the surprise. The more we looked, the more we realized this really seems to sit in its own lane, where you can find lots of examples on talking to people and executive presence and nuance, quote unquote, skills that make for people's views of different types of effective leaders, but nothing there really specifically addressing where leaders struggle most and then using evidence-based simple approaches to help them address those areas.
If I can just add to that, the problem is not that there are not enough books available to help. It's that there are not enough of the right books available to help people. And as a scientist, what I mean by the right books are books that offer evidence-based techniques. We've come a long way. We know that willpower doesn't work. But I think what we can offer leaders, exec coaches and so forth, is we can offer them the tools and strategies and techniques that will make a difference in the workplace.
I'm so excited for our readers to read your book. I have one final question for both of you. Why do you do the work that you do broadly?
It's going to sound a little bit hokey, but I'm a clinician at heart. Although I'm more and more in an administrative and training role, I got into this field because of passion for trying to help people deal with the problems that aren't always, in fact, almost never visible. And it's really sad to know that even in 2026, that we give people a pass when we can see evidence of their struggles, like through a wheelchair or a cast or crutches. But when it comes to mental health, for whatever reason, this tremendous stigma that's there prevents people who are struggling from accessing help that's readily available, that's got strong empirical evidence to show it can be tremendously powerful to improving their lives. And I've always wanted to do that. It doesn't matter the audience. I really get tremendous value out of trying to help an individual alleviate some of their struggles, and then on a broader level, trying to dismantle some of the stigma that still exists around what mental health is and, in fact, how common it is and normal it is to struggle.
So if I can offer an incredibly personal reason why I did this work. So I won't talk about leadership. I'm passionate about leadership and so forth. But let me just tell a story and then what I gained from it. I was at a conference many years ago and they had one of these fireside chats. And Richard Thaler was interviewing Danny Kahneman. And they're sitting up on the stage and there's many, many people listening. And Thaler asks Kahneman a question and he says, in a sense, why do you do all this? What motivates you to do all this amazing work? And Kahneman leans back and he thinks for a moment or two and he says, you got to love the people you work with. And sure, in this project, there was a dedication to want to help leaders, absolutely. But just personally being able to go back and reconnect with somebody who I knew many years ago, and Simon and I reconnected as colleagues and friends 20, 25 years ago, just helps you, I think, work better, write better. When you're facing deadlines, it becomes easier. Intellectually or academically, we call that multiplex relationships. When you have a wonderful working and personal relationship with somebody, everything goes better. And I think that for me was a highlight of being able to work on this book.
I love that. That's so joyous. Where can people find you online and where can they buy your book?
Any good bookshop, Amazon, the New Harbinger, the publishers, and I'm online at julianbarling.com.
Nowadays, it's easy with Google, but you can either Google my name or you can certainly punch my name in as simonrego.com as well, and that takes you to all the info that you would want, and then some.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you very much, Keaton.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Bye. Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher. And our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use. And please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.